Alright, so we are at part 2 of 10-6. We're talking about the circumference and area of a circle in this part. So now let's look here. If we have a circle and we know that the center is point P here, then the radius of a circle I'm going to define to be, let's say it's 8, right? Now, some of you may have seen this before. In fact, most of you have probably seen this before. There is a formula that you need to know here, and you can use it in one of two ways. You can either say the circumference, which again, what does that mean? It means that you're looking for basically the perimeter of the circle, or how long is the fence around the circle. If you want to think in terms of pizza, we're looking at how long would the crust of the pizza be if I were to break it apart, and measure the length of that crust there. Okay? So I'm looking for that distance, or the circumference, or the perimeter. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about it. So in this case, there's two examples, or two formulas. They both are the same thing, just written in a different way. The first one that you've seen, and this is the one that I usually say it is it's 2 pi r, meaning it's 2 times pi, which if you're asked to use a calculator, you will type in 3.14. There's typically, though, a pi button on your calculator, which I prefer you use, because then you're less likely to make rounding errors. So if you have a calculator with this button, I would rather you use that than 3.14 if I ask you to round it like to the nearest hundredth or thousandth or tenth or anything like that. Okay? That's kind of a side note, though. So that's what pi is. Then r stands for the radius of my circle. So in this case, I would have 2 pi r, which is 2 times pi, times the radius, which is 8. So now I have two like terms here. I have 2 and I have 8, which means I can multiply those together, and I could give you 16 pi. Now if I asked for an exact answer, this would be the exact answer. This one right here would be the exact answer, okay, because it's left in terms of pi, so this is exact. If I ask you to round it to the nearest hundredth or tenth or whatever it is, then you would need to type that into your calculator. So you do 16 times, and then hopefully you have a pi button there, 16 times pi, and that's how you would round it. But if you notice, what's 16? If we're looking at this circle, 16 relates to this circle in some way. And I hope that you notice, or at least maybe you remember, that my diameter is just what? It's twice as long as my radius, so my diameter here is 16. So if you notice, the circumference is also just pi times d. And then again, d stands for the diameter. So it's pi times diameter, which you can see that from this because we just have 2 times r, and if you double r, you end up with your diameter. So there's a couple ways of looking at it, and my diameter in this case is 16, so still you end up with 16 pi. Okay, I'm typically, like in class or something like that, I'm going to say this, but saying pi times diameter is not false. That's true as well. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to do a problem that we just did. We just did an example together. I'm not going to say, okay, the radius is 2, find the circumference, because you can do that. What I am going to say is there's the only other type of question really they could ask you is if a circle, or let's say circle C, has a circumference of 12 pi, I can ask you to find the radius, and I can ask you to find the diameter. I can ask you both questions. And later on, we'll connect this to area and to area. So but for now, we'll just leave it at that. So circle C has a circumference of 12 pi. Well, again, the circumference is just pi times diameter, or 2 pi r, right, depending on which one you prefer. So if I know that the circumference is 12 pi, and I'm trying to find the diameter, well, what do? I just divide both sides by pi, divide by pi, divide by pi, and I get the joy of canceling. Oh, not the d, wrong one. I get the joy of canceling. And I'm left with d equals 12. Right? And now I could go back to the original problem to solve for r, or I can just realize that r is half of d, right? Therefore, the radius would be 6. And units would be, I don't know what the units are. So we'd say the diameter is 12 units, the radius is 6 units. So, pretty straightforward. Should be able to do that. Let's move on to area. So the area of a circle. Again, we have a circle. Now instead of talking about the crust of this pizza, it's like we're talking about the cheese. So let's again say that this has a radius of 8. The area of a circle is given as pi r squared. So some students confuse when to use 2 pi r, when to use pi r squared, because they both have a pi, they both have an r, and they both have a 2. Right? But remember, your units for area is always something squared, which means the area is the one equation with squared in it. So that's how I remember that. So in this case, we would say the area is just pi times 8 squared, and you need to square the 8 first. Don't multiply 8 pi and then square that. You need to square the 8 first because the order of operations says that we need to do exponents first. And we're left with area equals 64 times pi, or just 64 pi. You don't have to put the dot. And again, units squared. So if I don't tell you if it's meters or inches or whatever, you would need to put units squared there. Okay, so that's a brief example. I could ask you the same question I asked you before. If the circumference, let's say the circumference of circle Q is 12 pi, I can ask you to find the area of that circle. So I'm given the circumference, C equals 12 pi. I want to find the area, which is pi r squared. So the only thing I need to know is the radius. So I need to somehow find the radius from here, right? Well, 12 pi is just the same thing as 2 pi r. When I divide both sides by pi, the pi's will cancel. I can divide both sides by 2, leaving me with 6. So I get 6 equals r. And now that I know that, I can plug it in here. So I get the area is pi times 6 squared, which is 36 pi, again, units squared, or square units. Okay, so that's kind of how circumference connects with the area there. Anyway, that should be it. Again, it seems maybe a little basic. We will start looking at how this connects to more complicated things, like soon, just a little teaser, if you will. Soon I'll be asking you something like this, like I'll give you an arc, and I'll say find the length of arc AB, not the measure of it, but the length. So you'll be able to tell me how long this is, and then later I'll ask you something like find the area of this portion of the pie here. Okay, so we're going to be doing that in the next section. Those two concepts, it's really not that complicated. It just seems scarier than it is. But it's not so bad. Okay, so I'm going to make this a creepy face and say, have a good day. Bye, guys.